thank you everybody for the really kind welcome. My name's Luke Sleeman. I work for Mantel Group, but I think we've got a little bit of a theme going with Use Old Computer about remembering the past and looking back. So following on from that theme, you bought a vintage computer. I have brought a vintage presentation. This is a talk about an app that I worked on over 10 years ago, and I gave this talk way back at the Yao Connected conference in 2015. So not only is it about a project that is now quite old, but I hope everybody here in the room is sitting down as I break the news to you. It's also about an Android app as well. I don't know why they let me in here. When Pat asked me if there was anything I could present at CocoaHeads, this talk immediately came into my mind. The Australian War Memorial app is quite different from the kinds of apps that most of us build day to day and work on. What I wanted to do is inspire people with what it's possible to create and talk about how a really simple app can do more than just inform or engages, but it can also provide a powerful experience that moves people, which is not something we commonly aim to do with our apps these days. This is the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. It is both a war memorial and a museum. And back at this project's inception 10 years ago, the World War I 100-year anniversary was upon us. As part of that, the War Memorial had completely refurbished their World War I galleries. During the refurbishment, they wanted to build an interactive audio experience where visitors would use devices and headphones to explore the galleries. The project brief was to build something that was really a world first. Now, what does that mean? I think we've all experienced a typical kind of audio tours that you have in museums where you get a set of headphones and you walk around and somebody's narrating and they say, on the left you're going to see this thing and on the right you're going to see this thing, it's something else. Instead of doing that, they wanted, rather than just a single track of narration, they wanted to provide rich soundscapes, to provide something that was both informative and emotional, and try doing something that had never really been tried before in museums in terms of providing an audio overlay that's going to enhance and provide a different experience. The solution had to be zero touch. They're a war memorial, they're a museum. They didn't want people wandering around inside the building, like mucking around with phones and pressing buttons and things like that. And it also needed to be a very frictionless experience because you have a whole bunch of visitors with different comforts with technology. They wanted something that's easy and straightforward for everybody to use. The final project had a number of parts, and I'm going to give you a quick walkthrough of the complete system. At the entrance to the gallery, users are handed a device and headphones. The War Memorial purchased 200 Nexus 5 devices for the program, which were running a custom ROM based on the Android open source project that was built specifically for this War Memorial project. The users, once they've got their device, walk over to an enormous interactive touch wall, which they use to select the tour that they want to experience. After they've chosen their tour, the users walk out and explore the galleries. As they walk around, the app uses Wi-Fi based indoor positioning to monitor their location. It mixes together different audio streams based on their position so that you can hear the sounds of battle or some narration explaining what it was like to land at Gallipoli. On the back end, we had a spatial content management system which defined the tours. It held all of the audio files, which allowed the museum to manage the tours along with tracking analytics and so on. The mobile devices would download all the audio data they needed for the tours when they were back recharging in their charging bays. I have to be clear, what I did on this was one very small piece in a very large project consortium that was headed up by a company called mental media. But I work directly under a company that many of us in the community might know called Art Processors, who hired me as a freelancer to work on the Android app. Art Processors were responsible for the mobile part of the system and the spatial content management system. So everything we were doing was working to Art Processors specs and Art Processors designs. And because they specialize in building systems like this for museums, they had a lot of great knowledge and experience, which helped us solve a lot of the tricky issues that came up. Another interesting person I got to work with on this project was somebody we'd know from the community, particular stuff we do with GDG, Sleeman, worked on building the custom Android open source project ROM for this. So, as you can probably tell already, there are a lot of fascinating parts to the project. But now that I've given you an overview of how the whole solution fits together, I wanted to zoom in on 3 particularly interesting technologies we used and explain them in more detail. They are the indoor positioning system, the audio engine, and a little something we call camera communicator. Indoor positioning uses Bluetooth beacons or Wi-Fi signals to allow a mobile device to figure out where it is inside a building. This is a technology that, even when this project began, had been around for a while, but was really just starting to gain traction. And I should also mention, I wasn't kidding about these slides being vintage. I decided not to update them from what I presented 10 years ago. So we could look at what my thinking was back then and see, are my predictions actually accurate? So at the time that I'd done this project and was giving this presentation, I thought, wow, this technology is incredible. This thing's going to be huge. If you look at the way that GPS has changed the world and the kinds of apps that are enabled by being able to know your position in the world and apply that to what's going on indoors, this is going to be enormous. It's totally wrong. We're still waiting for this huge boom in indoor position related apps and users and things like that. It actually, I think, as a technology is kind of underutilized. We don't, as a technology industry, really have great ideas on how to integrate it with the things that we're working with. And I think in that respect, it's almost a bit of a failure of imagination rather than a failure of the tech itself. It's something that I'd actually like to see used more widely. From a coding point of view, if you want to work with this kind of indoor positioning stuff, it was really simple for me to work with. We've got some Java up here. Yeah, I can see people at the back that are like, no, not the Java code. First he said Android, and now look at what we've got on the screen. It's very simple. It's even easy to do in Java. You implement an interface, you get callbacks with the position of the mobile device. But if you want to use an indoor positioning technology like we did, there are a couple of problems that you're going to run into. Firstly, every system, no matter what they're using, is only really accurate to a couple of meters. Secondly, just like with GPS, you'll know if you open up the Maps app and it has that little blue spot with your location, it's going to jump around a bit. You're going to get a bit of jiggle, and indoor positioning is exactly the same. So your app design, your solution design needs to deal with these issues right from the start. You can't just assume you're going to know precisely and accurately where the user is. Once we had our indoor positioning system working, the next step was to do something with that data. We needed an audio engine that would play sounds back based on the user's location. There's a couple of key requirements. It needed to deliver engaging audio. What does that mean? It means beyond just like playing a single audio track, it needed to be able to mix together multiple tracks. It needed to be able to add effects and do things like adjusting volumes dynamically, fading things in, fading things out, all these kind of fancier things. It needed to be able to be robust in terms of dealing with the uncertainty from indoor positioning. It needed to work with no user interface because we didn't want people playing with their phones and pressing buttons on them to play files and so on. But it also needed to be testable and debuggable. If it's got no UI, how are we actually going to test this thing and make sure it works? Originally, the consortium was considering things like doing an audio fall off based on distance to a sound source, where it'd like dynamically adjust the volume and mix things depending on how far away you were from something that was supposed to generate sound. But we realized that with that position drift, that blue dot would jump around even if the user wasn't walking. That would lead to the audio like fading in and fading out. It's going to give a really weird experience. So we realized we couldn't do that. And instead, art processors decided to go with a scheme where we divided the map up into a series of spaces. Each space associated with an audio file. And you'll note the spaces can overlap and be nested. This allowed us to build an audio engine that was event-based. It was really simple. There are only 3 possible events that could occur. A user moves into a space, the user remains within the space, and the user exits that space. In addition to those 3 event types, we also had 2 different types of audio. There were things, effects, which are things like gunfire or so on, and these effects tracks would play in a continuous loop, and they could stop and start at any time. We typically would add a fade in and a fade out on these audio effects when they stopped and started playing. And there are also interpretive tracks, which are essentially people talking. With an interpretive track, once it starts, you have to listen to it play the full way through. And art processors decided the best way to lay them out was usually to nest them. So as the user moves into a space, they start to hear the effects track playing to alert them that something's happening. And then they move deeper into the area and the interpretive audio starts playing with a narration, which will play until completed to compensate against any drift. So if the user drifts right out the edge of that space, the audio doesn't cut out. This scheme was really, really simple, and it helped the user explore and could produce really engaging effects. It was tolerant of the problems with locating the user accurately. And because this was an event-based system, it turned out the code was really, really simple. That core engine was only less than 500 lines of code in Java, which is an extremely verbose language. Since the engine was based on your position within the war memorial, as you can imagine, this was somewhat hard to debug from an office here in Melbourne. So we developed a testbed user interface where you could manually trigger off different events, which helped immensely with our quality assurance with our debugging. In general, we're building an app with almost no UI, so we had to think really hard from the beginning about how we're going to test and how we're going to debug it. So we needed a number of these testbed UIs there, which exposed the application's innards so that we could verify it was working correctly. Now that we've got the user's position, we can use it to play back audio. The final part of the project was to choose the tour that they would like to hear using this really big touch wall that you can see. Users would be prompted to place their devices on a touch table, and they could then use the interactive wall to select the tour which would be sent to the device. So we needed to figure out a way for the devices to communicate with the touch table. There are a few really hard constraints behind this. Firstly, the War Memorial had more than 200 devices that they purchased to do this. They were looking at having thousands of tours happen per day with these devices. We all know how hard it can be to get just a few mobile devices working reliably on your home Wi-Fi. So we're really worried about the difficulty of having all of these devices on the Wi-Fi. Whatever solution we came up with for communication needed to be highly reliable. It needed to be fast, and it needed to be seamless. So when we started to dig into this and think about how are we going to solve this problem, we looked at the communication that was required, and we realized that there was actually only 2 different messages that needed to be sent. The first message is from the device to the touch table saying that it had been placed on the table, so the table and wall would know to show the tour selection user interface. It turns out the table is a really cool piece of hardware. It had a built-in infrared camera inside the table looking up. So we use these things. They're called an infrared fiducial marker. Each one has a unique pattern on them. And we placed them on the back of custom cases that were built to hold the Nexus devices. The table hardware would read the marker, recognize the device, and then be able to feed information on the position and orientation of the device to the software that was running the touch wall display. So that was the first bit of communication from the device to the table. But once the user had used the table to select a tour, we needed to get the selection back to the mobile device so it knew what audio to start playing. Initially, we were thinking something like, something TCP/IP, maybe some web services. And I thought maybe each Nexus device could run a tiny little embedded web server in it, and the table could call that device's IP address. And I can see people at the back already shaking their heads. No, this is a terrible idea. What about all that Wi-Fi that's going to be constantly going down, devices dropping on and off? And we're looking for something really lightweight, running a web server in a mobile device, and it's very complicated, nowhere near lightweight enough. So, camera communicator was born. We realized that when you put it down on the table, the Nexus 5's camera would be looking at the display of the table. So we could have the table display a specific color to the device, which would be recognized by the camera. Each tour would have a color associated with it. So if the table showed red, it means tour number 1, blue means tour number 2, and so on. As we worked on camera communicator, there are a couple of key things that we learnt. Firstly, it became apparent really early on that any sort of lag or delay would ruin the experience. This had to be instant to appear magical. So I spent a lot of time optimizing the code, tweaking various parameters, getting it really responsive and quick. We also found that we needed to choose the colors very carefully so that they were evenly separated around the color wheel. Otherwise, it would be very easy for the code and the device to confuse two colors. We also found that the device auto exposure and auto white balance caused a lot of problems. Here's an example of that. We have red, 25500. It doesn't get a purer red than that. But if you put the phone down with its camera on that being displayed in a screen, this is what you actually see through the viewfinder, this kind of burnt, washed out, weird orange. And what's happening there is the camera has a whole bunch of automatic exposures, automatic white balance that it applies to the image to try and take a nice selfie of you. And it goes haywire when you point it at a screen like that. So we landed up having to turn off all of the automatic compensation and adjustments there in the camera. We also found that we needed to calibrate carefully based off what the Nexus 5 camera was actually seeing versus what we imagined we were going to see. How do we do that? It's there in the photo. We had a very hectic afternoon where we all flew into Canberra. You can see on the table there in the background, we've got a table of sort of colors being displayed, red, green, blue, orange. And we got as many Nexus 5 devices we could possibly get our hands on, sat them on top of each color, recorded what they were seeing, and used a laptop with Excel in it to do a whole bunch of averaging and color space conversions so that we could figure out what colors the devices should actually be targeting. When you put it all together, this is the end result. The user places the device on the table, the fiducial marker is detected, and the tour selection displays. The user chooses their tour on the wall, and the result is then communicated to the device. We found that in practice this worked really well for the limited set of colors. There was only, I think, 6 or 7 tours, so this was a great way of doing it. It was really reliable. We had no concerns about the Wi-Fi dropping out or any of that kind of stuff, and it provided that seamless, magical experience that we were looking for. I've talked a lot about the technology, but I wanted to wrap all of this up with a story about what it was like to actually use. Something a little bit more personal. A story about my first tour through the War Memorial using the app. I was in Canberra to test out the app on site, and when I chose my particular tour at the touch wall, I selected just randomly one called Family Matters, which is presented as a series of letters between an Australian digger off at war and his wife and children back at home. And you get to hear the letters read out as you explore the galleries. At first, as I started to walk out there, had my developer hat on. I was just really interested in, is the app working? Is it going to crash? No, it didn't crash. Is the audio going to play? Am I going to hear sounds? Yes, the audio was playing. It was all being triggered off properly. It was all working. And as I walked deeper into the galleries, I noticed this. It's an enormous painting titled Anzac, The Landing, 1915, by the famous war artist George Lambert. And it depicts the landing at Gallipoli, and it's the largest painting in the War Memorial collection. When you see it in person, it's an incredibly striking work. As I approached the painting, I began to hear the sounds of battle, gunshots, explosions, and then the noises of the wounded and people crying out. I stood there taking in the details on the painting, seeing the men struggle up the cliffs. And as I was looking, a letter from home started to play. And I listened to the narration, and it was from this guy's son back in Australia who was writing to his dad to say how wonderful it must be to go off and fight in the war, and what fun and an adventure his dad must be having, and how he'd love to be there joining him. And as I listened to all of this, I could see the actual reality right there in front of me. There was no wonderful adventure. I could hear the sounds of the people being machine gunned and the men as they struggled up the cliffs. Now, even though in a way I'm quite jaded, I'd been building the app for months. I knew how all the magic worked behind the scenes. It was still able to teach me a personal and powerful lesson about the realities of war. I hope I've managed to show you an app which is a bit different to the usual stuff we build day to day, and you come away with some great ideas on what it's actually possible to create. One reason I particularly like the War Memorial app, even after all these years later, is that so many of the things we built are optimized for engagement. Mobile apps want to pull you into the screen. They want to get your attention. They want you to interact. And we use all kinds of tricks and algorithms to try and steal people's attention. But the War Memorial app shows that instead it's possible to build apps that get you not to engage with your phone, but to engage with the things that are around you. So I think we've probably still got a few minutes left. I'll open up to the audience. Do we have any questions?
Hey Luke, thanks for your talk. I guess one question I'd have is, given that it's given the way technology has advanced over the past decade or so, would there be perhaps ways you might implement it differently if you had your chance again? Or
Yeah, I was thinking about that today. If we had our time over, or we had to remake this thing 10 years down the line, would we do it any differently? I think actually the answer is no, which is another reason I kind of really love this app and love the work that was done on it. In a way, it still feels very contemporary, in a way that many apps that were written 10 years, like you open an app built 10 years ago, right, that hasn't been updated, you'll know it right away. You will look at the UI, you'll look at the things it does, you'll look at the approaches it takes to things and be like, no, this is really dated. This thing wouldn't feel that way. I was thinking, maybe you could use some fancy NFC stuff. That's a little bit more common. But again, I can't see how you'd use it with the table. It would be, again, you're starting to get into this wireless communication. Every time I try and tap and pay at the credit card thing, it only works half the time. It doesn't connect. So we'd probably still go for the same color communicator. We'd probably still go for the same kind of indoor positioning system. We'd probably choose the same types of solutions.
Just Kotlin instead of Java.
Yes, just Kotlin instead of Java.
Do they still use it today?
I knew that question was going to ask, so I hopped on. I don't know. Yeah, everyone's pointing at Hugh because he's from Canberra. You go to the War Memorial all the time in Canberra, right? Yeah.
I think 8 years ago I remember using it.
Yeah. I had a look at the War Memorial website today to see their visitor guide and planning your visit, and they seem to have a few like audio tours that are not this. They're Hall of Museum, more traditional things. I suspect that after a while they would have turned it off and decommissioned it, mainly because this was always very experimental for them, and I almost got the impression that everyone was surprised that it worked so well. They were just going to go out on a limb. They were going to try something really, really different to the usual things. They were going to use a bunch of different and interesting technologies to try and explore and learn a bit more about how you can use technology in audio to provide these overlays. And I get the feeling they probably learned a lot from it and were like, yep, that was great, mission accomplished. We can turn it off and do other things now.
In a limited sense, a lot of what you're talking about in letting the app itself recede in favor of the experience fits very well with basically the overarching goal of typography. Good typography, it's just invisible. And you see aspects of this trying to be implemented in apps, right? But it's always isolated. It's always certain things, not the entire experience. Now, the success of this project, has that changed in any way how you think about how to approach more conventional projects?
I wish I could say yes, it inspired me. But the sad truth is I'm not actually involved in the design part of work, so 99% of the work, by the time it reaches me, the idea's already been formed up and shaped up, and we don't actually have a great deal of influence over the type, as engineers, of the kinds of solutions and things we're building, which I think is really unfortunate. I think the other thing is the dominant paradigm, the dominant economic paradigm at the moment still heavily favors engagement. It's what's in everybody's heads. We all want the metrics on like how many people are using the app, how many times a day, how many interactions, how long are they staying with it. So to be able to really dive deep into this, we need to go beyond just like, okay, how would this affect the things that I'm day-to-day building, and think more deeply about the role that apps play in people's lives, the kind of spaces that they can fulfill within our lives, and how we could do it. And I'd love to see a bit more of a move to step away from this like engagement, doom scrolling Instagram kind of world to something maybe a little bit more considered that allows things to fade into the background. I don't see any signs of that happening at the moment though.
One more, maybe? We can go for it. Thanks for the talk, Luke. That's really interesting. I know you predominantly worked on the app, but I'm really curious around why custom ROM was needed. I know you touched on sort of the camera stuff, disabling some of those things. Was there sort of anything else beyond that was necessary?
Yeah, the custom ROM was really, really interesting. I'm glad you asked me about that. First, one of the interesting aspects about this project was actually using Android devices at all. If you remember way back to this sort of day and age, Apple was selling a lot of the iPod Touch devices that were really commonly used for museum installations and these kind of things. I believe one of the reasons they actually wanted to try the Nexus devices and try the custom ROM is because it gave us a huge amount of control over what was actually running on the device, how they would work with the environment. So some of the things we did. Max is great. He stripped out everything, all of the bloat, all of the stuff. He's like, you don't need any of this stuff running on the device. And he in fact stripped out like the entirety of the UI. So there was like no sort of launcher or other things. It was just basically like our app, and that was the entire OS that you had there. There was also a few other things he built in there behind the scenes that allowed us to push out updates to the app dynamically, because this wasn't delivered from the Play Store. And to be able to do that and overwrite an installed app, he needed kind of the root certificates that the OS had been signed with, but because you're building a custom ROM, he's in charge of the signing certificates. So we're able to come up with our own like kind of tiny little DIY enterprise managed environment where we had complete control over the hardware and what was going on. It was another really fascinating aspect of the project. And again, that ability on Android to like fully customize the OS down to a really low level is something that doesn't get leveraged as much as maybe it could.
That's awesome. Thank you very much, Luke.
Thanks for having me.